I'd like to call up our Shaykh, Syed Imaduddin Quadri Al-Jeelani, Pasha.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. جل جلاله وعم نواله وعظم شأنه وبين برهانه والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان المتلازمان على سيدنا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وآله وسلم وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين وأصحابه الغر الميامين. أما بعد، فقال الله عز وجل في كتابه المجيد والفرقان الحميد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك لمن الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Just 2 minutes before I was about to come up here, I received a message simply saying, 43 minutes already, schedule me. I hear you, brother. So inshallah, I'll keep my speech very short, very brief. I welcome all of the dignitaries, mashayikh, ulama, and all the highly respectable brothers and sisters behind the veil. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are gathered here for actually a multitude of reasons. Gallery Sharif, fundraising, Qawani Sharif, and last but not least, to share our pain with the rest of the Ummah on the plight of Palestine. So let me start with a few words on the topic related to Gallery Sharif. And when that comes up, the first thing that comes to mind is this is something related to Sufism, or Tasawwuf. And unfortunately, very often we hear incorrect definitions, incorrect descriptions of what Sufism is. You often hear Sufism is adherents or a group of people who wear the suf, which is an article of clothing, a cloth, which is true. People who are focused on tarkul dunya, leaving the worldly pleasures, may be wearing suf. But wearing a certain type of wool does not define a group of people who are spending their lives in ibadah, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a very simplistic definition. And you hear many other descriptions, but for the sake of time I'll tell you that really Sufi comes from tazkiyah, from safa. Safa is the purification of the heart, purification of the soul, tazkiyatun nafs, safa an-nafs. So when I was looking for some really brief and descriptive description of what Sufism, I found something very interesting that Imam al-Nawawi, and most of you have heard or know about Imam al-Nawawi, a great scholar of the 7th century Hijri, author of books like Al-Ba'in al-Nawawi and Riyad al-Salihin. Those who are reading already know the names that I've just mentioned. Very prolific, very important scholar and Imam. Also a follower or an adherent to Sufism. He, in one of his books, Al-Tawheed wal-Ibadah wa Usul al-Tasawwuf, he writes that Sufism really can be described, or the principles of Sufism can be described in 5 different elements. One is, he says in this book, he describes them very subtly and very clearly, that it is really the at-taqwallahi fi sirri wal-alaniyah. That you remember Allah, you are God-weary both in public and in private. That you remember God, that you are God-fearing, if you will, that you're God-weary both in private and in public. When you're by yourself and nobody's watching you in a closed room, or when you're in public. People do different things when the situation changes. But the Sufis are trained, or Sufis are those who are very vigilant of themselves, that Allah is watching them in all times and all places.
SubhanAllah.
Another one that he says, the second description, or the principle that Sufis follow, or Sufis should follow, is the Itba' al-Sunnah fi al-Akhwali wal-A'mal. That they follow the Sunnah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, both in word and in action. That has to be there. It can't be that you're preaching morality to people, preaching ibadah and worship of Allah and oneness of Allah and preaching Islam to people, but then your actions and deeds speak completely a different language. What Sufism teaches is that you have to have the unison between your qawl and amal, your words and your actions. And then he goes on to add the third bullet, and he says, Al-i'radi 'an al-khalqi fi al-iqbali wal-idbar. That you have deference. You do not care what people say or people approve of and what people reject. When you are in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you're practicing your deen, that you do not care how you're wearing. When it is time to pray, you find a location, a corner to pray. What your beliefs are, you are unapologetic about it. You do not care what people think or how they comment or how they may ridicule or make fun of you in school, especially the young men and women who are here. It doesn't matter, because to reach nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to disregard what people say and think about when you are doing the right thing in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fourth thing that he mentions, الرضا عن الله في القليل والكثير. That you are satisfied. You are content with what Allah has given you. That's what Sufism teaches. That you are content with the little that Allah has given and with the abundance that Allah has given. In whatever situation Allah has placed you, you are content, you are grateful, you are thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is part of the teachings of Sufism. And last but not least, Imam Nawawi then shares is the trait or the principle that Sufis live by, is the al-ruju'i ila Allah fi as-sarra'i wal-dharra. That you return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when Allah has given you. And you return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when Allah has taken away from you. When you are happy, when you have surur, when you are enjoying, you return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you're sorrowful, when you're sad, and when you are in hardship, you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you are not oblivion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're always remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These are the ways of Sufism. These are the teachings of Sufism. Not that they wear wool, not that they have colored rumal, or colored amama, or colored clothes, or they twirl in circles, round in circles, and they do zikr. All these might be expressions of tasawwuf. All these might be expressions of that culture and they're taken from deen. As long as they're not violating the tenets of Islam, they're all permissible. But Sufism really is, as the Quran says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ تَزَكَّى. That person has succeeded who has performed the tazkiyah, purification, purified, and that is safa. And ibadah, this is the primary goal of a human being that Allah expects from us. And then when we talk about what's going on in Palestine, and as a layperson, as a common human being who has no power, who has no kursi, who has no say or no influence over others, what do? Our hearts are wrenched. We feel the pain. We cry at night when we see the videos, the posts that we see. They are brothers. Rasulullah says it, that when ummah should be like when a portion of your body gets an injury, the entire body feels the pain. Allahu Akbar. That is what the ummah is, and we are living that. We, like it or not, knowingly or unknowingly, we are feeling the pain. This is natural. We are feeling this human suffering that's going on, and we're feeling it in our heart. But what can we do? We are helpless. Well, there is one thing that Rasulullah says, and with that I conclude that most often people do everything that may or may not be something that they are required to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in place obligations upon us, fara'id upon us, wajibat upon us. So if we do what is obligatory upon us, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take away the suffering. It is near to Allah. In a hadith as narrated in Muslim, by Imam Muslim, he said, Rasulullah, he quotes what Rasulullah said and says, that Rasulullah says, Al-ibad fil haraj kal-hijrati ilayya. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says that the worship in times of hardship, worship, ibadah in times of hardship is like the hijrah, migration towards Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Why migration towards Rasulullah? Because migration is ibadah. When it was commanded to the Sahaba in Makkah al-Mukarramah to migrate towards Madinatul Munawwarah. Allahu Akbar. This is such a great act of worship that Sayyidina Umar al-Faruq radiallahu ta'ala anhu says that my entire life's ibadah, my entire life's good deeds, I would sacrifice for those beautiful, blessed moments that Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu had spent with Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam during the time of migration, during the hijrah. So Rasulullah says, when you return to ibadah, when you return to worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is like you are doing hijrah towards me. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Moulana Muhammad wa ala alihi. And with that I conclude, and I thank you all for joining us. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.
Takbir! Takbir! Nara takbir! Nara